Okay, so this is a reaction to episode 5 of 1899, which is called The Calling. Although, in homage to my mate Stuart Luff, I'm going to rename it The Yeeting, of which more anon. This is another one of those fast-paced episodes. Just like the previous one, we get quite a lot of backstory, extra information about the characters. The plot is moving on at pace. And I want to begin, obviously, at the beginning. That's probably the best place to start. So I was wrong last time. This is episode 5, so there's actually 8 in the series. So I've gone past the halfway point. I was wrong last time in the sense that I thought that each episode would focus on a particular character with its opening. But actually this one opens again with Maura having her dream, her vision of being in the mental institution and waking up. She's wandering through this landscape which looks sort of Scottish, possibly. A sort of mountainous landscape, heather, all that kind of thing. She sees this cross, possibly marking a grave that actually has the phrase "wake up" written on it as well. So that's how it opens this time, and like I say, we get a lot more in terms of backstory and information. But we see the two camps now who are fighting against each other. The ones that obviously want to keep a ship on course for America, and those who want to return back to Europe. And they're sort of at a stalemate at the moment. But what's also happened is that the boy has been locked in the cupboard again. Again, it's a kind of deja vu situation. Just as he was found on board the Prometheus, now he's locked in the same sort of situation in a cupboard on the Prometheus, on the Kerberos, sorry. So we also have a bit of sort of dissent in the ranks. The Danish woman who's pregnant, she actually decides to join the other side. She's not happy with the religious fanatic of her mother and her sort of leading the troops towards chaos and anarchy. So she goes to see the other camp, and as she does so, the boy is banging on the inside of the cabinet, and as a result, a gun is drawn, and Daniel, who's also present, throws himself towards Maura in a sort of act of protection from this drawn weapon. The gun is fired, but then everything stops. Basically, we're in a situation that's very reminiscent of the bullet time from The Matrix. So the only person that can actually move is Maura, and she actually walks over to the bullet. You can see the actual the pressure wave from the bullet, and she takes hold of the bullet and basically lifts it from that pressure wave. It did make me think surely the bullet would be very hot to the touch, but it's not. And the reason is because it's not a real bullet. Again, it's this whole idea that what we're in is a kind of simulation. This is not real. You can't stop time in that way. Okay, once a bullet's been fired like that, it will continue on to its target. And she then speaks to the boy and basically demands to know what the hell's going on. She's convinced that he's had something to do with this. So what happens next is the boy takes her by the hand and leads her away. whereupon time is initiated again, and the characters sort of assume their previous positions. Daniel ends up sort of sprawled on the floor after he's thrown himself towards Mora, but of course Mora's not there, and neither is the boy, and everybody sort of scratches their heads and thinks, what the hell's going on? Okay, as we did as viewers. So the boy leads her back to her cabin, where they have a tete-a-tete. And as I had suggested in one of my earlier reactions, it was obvious that the boy could speak. It was just a case of this wasn't the right time, whereas now is the right time, or at least it's time for him to write something on a pad, on a notepad, which he does. And he writes 3 words: they are listening. So the idea is that they must be those people who are in charge of this simulation, the people who are watching, the watchers. And he also speaks. He says, basically, he whispers to her and says, I can't tell you. And then he adds something else, something cryptic. He says, I think he says, you need to ask the creator. Interestingly, in the subtitles, creator is spelt with a capital C. So we're thinking in terms of the creator, God, etc. But in reality, of course, we should be thinking more, I think, in terms of like a video creator, like the creator of the game, because we're in a game. There's no doubt about that. It's a video game of some sort. So what happens next is that the boy leads her to the shaft that's underneath her bed. And while I'm thinking about this, I want to mention the fact that it's interesting that both of these shafts, because there's one underneath her bed, there's one underneath the captain's bed. It's interesting that those 2 shafts are linked to sleep, dreams, etc. They're underneath a bed. I think that's significant because basically the shaft that's under Mora's bed leads to her memory of being imprisoned in the lunatic asylum, and the shaft that's underneath the captain's bed leads to his memory of the house where his wife and daughters burned to death. So anyway, they go down into the shaft, and the little door opening beetle is employed once more for its usual purpose. It basically reconfigures the inside of this tiled shaft. Remember, before I'd even speculated that the inside of this shaft was like the inside of a computer, that the walls were kind of like microchips. But anyway, a portal is opened, and the portal leads, no surprises, to the Scottish-looking landscape that we saw in Mora's dream. And when they actually emerge into this landscape, the portal itself, or at least the door to it, the rectangular opening, sort of compresses just to 2 dimensions. Instead of being a 3-dimensional space, it compresses just to 2 dimensions. So meanwhile on the ship, things take a turn for the worse. There's a siren starts to blare, and just out of interest, I had a thought in respect of that siren, because it made me think, I'm thinking back to old sort of Hammer horror films and stuff like that, where you might feature somewhere like Broadmoor or some sort of psychiatric hospital or whatever. But the idea of a siren going off is very often an indication in a situation like that that a patient has escaped. So that's something to certainly bear in mind, this blaring siren. But anyway, the captain basically tells the guys on his team that they're burning through the coal too fast on the boat, that they'll only have about 2 days' supply left if they go at that rate, so they're just going to end up lost at sea. They won't be able to make land. And he's basically almost sort of challenged by Daniel to sort of man up, become captain, because he's sort of let things slip in a sense. He's allowed all this to happen, this anarchy to take place, and Daniel is almost sort of inspiring him to take charge again, to become the captain again. They're going to have to take control of the ship and alter its course. That's basically what they're going to have to do. However, there's then a further event takes place, which is linked to what I said earlier, to the yeeting. And there's this strange ticking noise, which is like the ticking of a clock, the second hand of a clock ticking away. And it also reminds me, to a certain extent, of what happened in episode 1 with Mrs. Wilson, where she takes the sip from her cup. There's that little clink, and everybody else in the dining room does the same thing, with perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions, including Maura. But anyway, the ticking is the prelude to something dramatic happening, because people start pacing, walking in time to this ticking. They become like zombies. They become zombified. And they start walking away. And I think it's even pretty obvious where they're going to be going. They're going up on deck. That's where they're going. And it's virtually impossible to stop them. Like I say, you can speak to them, try and restrain them, but they just keep on going. Now, there are only certain, well, the majority of the characters are doing this, but most of the main characters don't fall in step. However, there are a few that we've seen that you would think are fairly important. Cresta is one of them, the mother of Mai Ling, I think that's the geisha's name. She falls in step. You're already thinking as well here in terms of the video game angle of NPCs, non-playing characters. These people are expendable, and so it proves, because they end up going on to the deck, and the first one to actually throw herself overboard is the mother of the geisha. She's the first one of the lemmings to throw themselves into the sea. And of course, it makes you wonder whether this process has already taken place on the Prometheus. That's why there are no bodies on the Prometheus. They've all thrown themselves overboard. So that is the yeeting, and it's quite a spectacular thing to watch, as all these hundreds of people are committing suicide, theoretically. So we then have an encounter between Maura and the captain, and we learn more things as a result of this all later on, but I'll just run through what happens between Maura and Captain Ike. They basically go through the tunnel that is under the captain's bed, and not surprisingly, it leads to the landscape where his house is situated, where his wife and daughters burned to death. So again, it's this idea that the tunnel underneath his bed corresponds to his own sort of nightmare past. What happens also is that we see an encounter. I should go back actually, because there's an encounter when Maura goes to the Scottish landscape. There's an encounter between her and her father, who's called Henry Singleton. Now, in terms of what he says to her, it looks like he's searching for something. He's asking her, "Where have you hidden it?" And so there's some sort of mystery as to what he's actually searching for. But we also see him with the hypodermic needle in the mental institution. We see Maura being injected again in the neck. But coming back to the episode with Maura and Captain Ike, they go back, as I say, to the site of his sort of nightmare. But we learn more about Maura herself. She has ideas that perhaps she was actually a doctor in a mental institution, but that her father is trying to convince her that she was actually a patient. We learn that she is not Maura Franklin, that's her mother's maiden name. She's actually Singleton. We learn that the father is Henry Singleton, and we also learn the name of the brother. I've temporarily forgotten what the name is now, and we also learn that the father was hell-bent on conducting experiments on the brain and human behaviour and such like. So the idea is that the ships have been kitted out in order to further that research. What else can I say in terms of the? Oh yes, there's more use. I think I should also mention more about the character of Daniel, because he's clearly connected to the boy. When they go through the tunnel and arrive in the Scottish landscape, he's basically questioning the boy. The boy also remarks how they've reached further than they've ever done before. Again, this is the idea that they're in some sort of video game, and that they've gone beyond what they did in the past. So it looks as if those two characters are working together. We also see the first mate again up to his nefarious deeds. He's clearly basically activating things, setting things in motion again. He has access to one of the sort of handheld devices, which Daniel also has. So we've seen two of those devices. Like I say, the first mate has got one and Daniel has got one. And I do wonder about its origin, because of course I'm going to speculate that Daniel obtained that handheld device from the Prometheus. Okay, he's plugging it into the console on board the Kerberos and activating things, but in reality I'm sure he actually got his hands on it on the Prometheus, and that's allowing him to reconfigure things on board the Kerberos. We see him getting hit over the head and over the back with a shovel by one of the stokers, who doesn't understand what's going on, not surprisingly, since Daniel has a pocket torch in his mouth. The stoker is looking at it and thinking, what's that thing? I've never seen one of those before in 1899. Of course you haven't, mate. It's from the future. So after the yeeting has been well and truly completed, we're left with maybe only a dozen or so characters on board the ship, on the actual on the on the actual top of the ship, right at the end, because everybody else, I think there are still a few people possibly down below decks, but I think everybody else by that stage has committed suicide. The lemmings have thrown themselves overboard. But anyway, one of the crew who is still functioning, although who the first mate turns off using his handheld device. This is something that Daniel also does to one of the stokers. He just basically turns him off, like you turn off a character in a video game. One of the crew members manages to get a message from the shipping company, and the message is exactly the same message as before: sink ship. But of course what they mean now is sink the Kerberos. They're not referring to the Prometheus at all. It's sink the Kerberos. And that is spelled out by Daniel. He makes it clear to the survivors that, yep, this is what they want us to do. So we've got this motley crew left now on board the ship, and as we see them, we then switch to another scene where we view Moira's father, Henry Singleton, because he is then presented with a message from one of his flunkies, which is in connection with what they call Project Kerberos, and the message is delivered in the form of the triangles again. And what's interesting here is that the father is in a room. He's obviously indoors somewhere. This is not on board a ship. There's a fire burning. But what's interesting are the props in the scene, because to his left there are two trim phones which date from the late 1960s and early 1970s. And once again, that corresponds with the kind of music that we're hearing, because this time we go back to 1970. We go to Black Sabbath, The Wizard, from the first album. And when we look at the rest of the interior of this study where Henry Singleton is, all the clues point to like the 1970s, that kind of era, because we've got computers whirring away, except they're ones based on around tape, not solid state hard disk kind of computing. You know, this is the more old-fashioned style. So the whole interior there is it's redolent of, it reeks of the 1970s, that kind of era. And then Henry proceeds to walk over to the window. He draws the curtains, and we see this black pyramid in the landscape, the same black pyramid that we saw in episode 1, at the beginning of episode 1. So what can we sort of learn from this? Well, obviously it's this whole idea again of a video game taking place, or that we're in somebody's dreams, in the sense that they're dream sharing, like the characters do in the Nolan film Inception. We're certainly not in 1899, so the boat doesn't exist. Or the boats, I should say, the Kerberos, the Prometheus, they don't exist in reality. You know, the gun that fired the bullet is not a real gun. So where are we? Well, you'd have to say some sort of alternate reality, some steampunk version of the 1970s is a possibility, and that this voyage on board the Kerberos is actually part of some sort of social experiment. that's being played out, possibly with characters who are asleep or are dreaming. It's that kind of situation. So I think we're in that sort of era. We're not in 1899. I've said this before. We can't be in 1899. This is not. I mean, the creators of Dark and the creators of this series have already said that they're not sort of repeating themselves. So I don't think this is some sort of time travel program. I think it's more a case of it's an alternate reality 1970s where we have this kind of video game that's been produced, which is based, well, it's Project Kerberos. It's based around the ship. People think they're on board a ship and they're playing out their lives. They're basically reliving aspects of their lives over and over. It's that kind of situation, I think, is what we find ourselves in. I think I've said enough about the programme. I might have missed a few things here and there. But I think I've covered most of the stuff I wanted to talk about. Loving it as ever, and pleased to see that Maura's father is going to take a bigger role, because I knew Anton Lesser would have a big role in this, because you're not going to employ such a well-known actor and for him just to say a few lines. Oh yes, the other thing he said to Maura was, "You're not asking the right questions." So of course we're thinking to ourselves, what are the right questions? But that's probably for another reaction. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my speculations and ramblings for today. There will be more to come, and I'll be doing episode number 6 next time round.